She found him bleeding and she stayed, which was the first mistake, because Han Sung-joon had built his entire world on the certainty that no one stayed. And the moment she broke that rule, something in him decided she was never leaving. He was impotent, feared, and surrounded by people quietly planning to use his condition to take everything he had built. And she was a housekeeper from Nashville with no reason to be loyal to any of it. And yet she was the only person in that entire compound who treated him like his life was worth saving. But the real shock wasn't the night they spent together, wasn't the betrayal that came after, wasn't even the diagnosis that should have made what happened between them biologically impossible. The real shock was what she discovered 11 days later, alone on a cold tile floor, staring at a result that rewrote every rule of the story they thought they were living. Welcome to Black and Soul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. Alice Johnson was not supposed to be there. She had applied for the corporate housekeeping exchange program through her university's international partnership, expecting a modest office building in Central Seoul, a small stipend, and enough money to send home to her younger sister in Nashville. What she got instead was a black SUV with tinted windows, a blindfold she was not given but felt anyway, and a compound that rose above the Han River like a palace built by someone who wanted God to feel small. The Suncorp compound was not a business. It was a statement. Marble floors, ceilings that swallowed sound, staff who moved like they had been trained to be invisible. And at the center of it all, Han Sung-joon, 34. Twice divorced on paper, never divorced in reputation. The kind of man whose name made other men lower their voices. She heard about him before she ever saw him. The kitchen staff whispered in fast Korean she was still learning. The security team watched every door like the walls themselves might betray them. And on her first morning, her supervisor, a tight-lipped woman named Mrs. Beck, pressed a laminated card into Alice's hands with a floor plan and a single instruction. You do not go to the East Wing. Ever. Alice had nodded. Then, 3 days later, she went to the East Wing. Not out of defiance. She had followed the sound of something breaking. A glass. Then silence. Then the unmistakable sound of a man trying not to make any sound at all. She pushed the heavy door open and found Han Sung-joon on his knees beside a broken decanter, one hand braced against the wall, the other pressed to his ribs. His white shirt was dark with blood. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see it working from across the room. And his eyes, when they lifted to find hers, were not cold the way she had been warned. They were exhausted, furious, and underneath all of that, terrified. She did not ask permission. She crossed the room, crouched beside him, and said in the steadiest voice she had, "Tell me where it hurts." He stared at her like she had spoken in a language no one had ever used in that house. Then he said nothing, so she started working. Later, she would not be able to explain what made her stay. He did not ask for help. He did not thank her. He washed her clean and bandaged the wound along his side with the focused silence of a man calculating something. When she finally sat back on her heels, he spoke for the first time. "You are the new housekeeper." She confirmed it. He said nothing else. But when she stood to leave, his hand closed around her wrist. Not roughly, just enough. She looked back at him. He released her immediately, like he had not meant to reach. Like his body had made a decision before his mind could stop it. She left without another word. And Han Sung-joon sat in the silence she had filled and felt something he had not felt in years. Disturbed. A few days later, the compound felt different to Alice. She could not name it exactly, but doors that had been locked were now unlocked. Her keycard worked on 3 additional floors. Mrs. Beck told her she had been reassigned to the residential quarters. And twice in one morning, she passed Han Sung-joon in a hallway, and both times he stopped as if surprised to find her there. Even though she had the distinct and unnerving feeling he had known exactly where she was. She filed it away and kept working. She had learned early in life that powerful men came in 2 varieties. Those who wanted to be seen performing power, and those who simply were power so thoroughly they didn't need to perform. Han Sung-joon was the second kind, and the second kind was always the more dangerous. What she did not know, and what the security team certainly would not tell her, was that Han Sung-joon had already pulled her complete file. Her university records, her family situation, her sister in Nashville, 14 years old and on scholarship, her mother's medical debt, still outstanding. He had read it all in 20 minutes and then sat with it in a way that made his second in command, a sharp-faced man named Director Shin, deeply uncomfortable. She is a housekeeper, Shin had said carefully. Han Sung-joon had looked at him. I know what she is. And then he had said nothing else, which was somehow worse than any instruction. The attack that nearly killed him happened on a Tuesday evening. Alice was finishing the east corridor when she heard the vehicles. 3 of them. Fast. Then the sound that no amount of marble insulation could fully absorb. Gunfire. Short and professional and very close. She pressed herself into a doorway. Counted. Breathed. And then she heard footsteps coming toward her, uneven and too slow. Han Sung-joon came around the corner with 2 bullets in him. One in the shoulder. One that had grazed his thigh and was bleeding in a way that suggested it had clipped something important. He saw her. His legs buckled. She caught him before he hit the floor, which surprised them both because she was not a small woman, but he was not a small man, and yet she held him. He gripped her arm, and she felt every ounce of control it took him to stay conscious. Who are you? He said, not for the first time. Someone who keeps finding you bleeding, she said. Help me get you to a room. Do you think a man like Han Sung-joon had ever let anyone help him in his life? Drop a comment below. And while you think about that, please like, share, and subscribe to Black and Soul TV so you never miss a story. She got him to his private room. She called no one because he told her not to. She worked with the medical kit she found locked in his bathroom, because of course he had a medical kit, and she asked no questions while she worked except the clinical ones. This will hurt. Tell me if you feel faint. Stop gripping that with your left hand. You are making it worse. He obeyed, which was the strangest part. Han Sung-joon, who directed organizations with a glance and ended negotiations with silence, let Alice Johnson give him instructions in accented Korean mixed with firm English and followed every one. When she finally finished and sat back against the wall, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline, he looked at her from the bed with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was the look of a man who had just discovered something he did not have a category for. Why are you still here? He said. Because you would have bled out if I left, she said. He was quiet. Then, very quietly, he said, no one stays. She looked at him. I noticed, she said. She meant it as an observation. He received it like a confession. The next morning, Director Shin informed Alice that her role had been restructured. She was now assigned exclusively to the main residential floor. Her salary had been increased without her requesting it, and she had been given a room inside the main compound rather than the staff quarters across the grounds. She stood in the doorway of this new room, which was larger than her entire apartment in Nashville, and understood that something had shifted in the architecture of her situation. She was no longer simply an employee. She was not yet sure what she was instead. Han Sung-joon recovered in 3 days. On the 4th day, he appeared in the corridor while she was working, moving stiffly but upright, and watched her for a moment before he spoke. You hum while you work. She paused. Is that a problem? No. He seemed almost puzzled by his own answer. Then he walked past her, and she noticed he moved slightly to her side of the hallway rather than expecting her to step aside. A small thing. The kind of small thing that accumulates. A week after the attack, she heard Director Shin's voice through a door she passed. The name is circulating. They know about the condition. There was a pause. Then Han Sung-joon's voice, lower, controlled. How many? At minimum 3 of the outer families. Shin's voice tightened. They're already testing the perimeter, Sung-joon. If they confirm it, this becomes a succession crisis. And a succession crisis becomes a war. She walked past quickly. She filed it in the same place she filed everything else. The quiet archive of things she understood without being told. That evening he called her to his study. She had expected a reprimand. She had been in a part of the building she was not cleared for, and he may have known. Instead, he was standing at the window with his back to her, and he said, "Close the door." She did. He said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. He turned to face her, and she saw it again. That unfamiliar thing in his expression, the exhaustion underneath the control. There is a medical situation. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed too many times and are tired of the weight of. I have been impotent for the past 14 months. A condition. Not permanent, the doctors suggest, but currently confirmed and currently being used against me by people who want my chair. He paused. I am telling you this because what I am about to propose involves you, and you deserve to know the truth of what the deception is built on. She held very still. He continued. I need it believed that I have taken someone to my bed. The rumors need a foundation. You were already seen helping me after the attack. You are already inside this compound. He looked at her directly. I am asking you to spend one night here, visibly, in a way that allows my staff to draw conclusions. Nothing will happen, but the appearance of something must. She stared at him. You could just fire me and save us both the trouble. He almost smiled. I could, but I find I don't want to. That admission sat in the air between them like a lit match. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I want full transparency going forward. If you lie to me, I walk. Any version of walking. He said, agreed. She said, one night. Just one. He said, just one. Neither of them believed it even then. That night, she went to his room. He had arranged a sitting area by the windows, 2 chairs, whiskey on a small table, the kind of staging that was meant to look natural and didn't quite. She sat. He sat. They drank in silence for a while. The compound was quiet around them. Soul glittered far below through the glass. Can I ask you something? She said. He said yes. How long has it been since someone sat with you without wanting something from you? The question landed differently than she had intended. She watched him process it, watched something in his jaw tighten, and then release. He looked at the glass in his hands. 14 months, he said. Since the diagnosis. Before that, I am not sure I would have noticed the difference. She did not respond immediately. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are both being careful and both failing at it. She set her glass down. He was watching her. The room had grown dark around them without either of them moving to turn on a light. He said her name quietly. Just her name. Alice. And the way he said it, like it was something he was only just allowing himself, made the air between them change completely. She stood. He stood with her. They were very close. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the control it cost him. You should stay on your side of this, she said softly. I know, he said. Neither of them moved. Then he did. Not toward her. He sat back down, pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes, and said, I cannot do this properly. I cannot perform what this night is supposed to be. And the shame of that is one thing. But the shame of you being here for it is something else entirely. She sat beside him this time. Not across from him. Beside him. She did not touch him yet. She simply reduced the distance. It is just a night, she said. And you are not what you do or don't do in one night. He looked at her sideways. You are very strange for someone who works for me. She smiled. You keep saying I work for you like it's going to start meaning something different. He looked at her for a moment. Then very slowly he reached out and took her hand. Just held it. His hand was warm and careful and slightly trembling. They stayed like that until he fell asleep in the chair, and she covered him with the blanket from the bed, and she sat awake watching Soul breathe below them, understanding that whatever this was, it had already gone past the edge of what either of them had agreed to. The morning broke pale and cold. He woke to find her still there. He said nothing. She said nothing. He made coffee, which surprised her because she had assumed he had people for that. He handed her a cup and they stood at the window together, and she felt the moment arrange itself in her memory as something she would return to for years. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was just 2 people standing in early light, holding warm cups, not explaining themselves. He said eventually, this changes things. She said, I know. He said, I'm not sure I know how to have this. She said, neither am I. He said, that might be the most honest conversation I have had in this building. She laughed, short and real. He looked at her like the sound was something he wanted to put somewhere safe. 3 days later, the pressure from outside accelerated. Director Shin brought intelligence that 2 rival families had begun moving assets in ways that suggested they intended to test Han Sung-jun's authority directly. There were also reports of someone inside the compound feeding information outward. Sung-jun worked through the night, 3 nights running. Alice brought him food, he forgot to eat, and took the empty cups back. She did not comment on the dark circles. He did not ask her to stop coming. On the 3rd night, she found him at his desk with his head in his hands, and sat across from him in silence for 20 minutes before he finally looked up. I cannot determine who the leak is, he said. It is someone who knows enough to be dangerous and is careful enough to be invisible. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I used to be able to see the shape of a betrayal before it completed. Alice said, when did that change? He thought about it. 14 months ago, he said, when I stopped trusting my own judgment about everything else. She said, you trusted me. He paused. Yes, he said. I did. Like that was the data point he had been missing. What happened next shocked even the people inside his organization who thought they had seen everything. Would you have expected the betrayal to come from where it did? Like, share, and subscribe to Black and Soul TV, and drop your guess in the comments before you keep reading. The breach came from director Shin himself. Alice found out not through espionage, but through accident. She was returning a tray to the kitchen corridor and heard Shin speaking in low, rapid Korean on his phone around a corner. She understood enough. Payment confirmed. The condition is documented. Transfer after the vote. She stood very still. Then she walked carefully back the way she came, set the tray down in the nearest room, and sat on the floor of a linen closet for 4 minutes while her heart did things hearts were not designed to do. Then she stood up. She walked directly to Han Sung-jun's study. She knocked. She told him what she had heard with the same precision she used for everything. No embellishment, no emotion, just the words in order. He listened without moving. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "You are sure?" "I am sure." He stood. She watched his entire face close down, become the thing she had heard about before she ever met him. The thing that moved silently and ended things. She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Handle it." She said, "Are you going to be safe?" He stopped at the door. Looked back at her. The coldness in his face cracked just slightly at the edges. "No one asked me that," he said. "Someone should," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he left. Shin was removed from the compound that evening. The process was quiet and absolute, and Alice did not ask for details. What she knew was that by midnight, Han Sung-jun came back to the main residence with blood on his shirt that was not his own, and she met him in the corridor with a clean shirt and hot water and the silence of someone who understood that there were parts of a person's life you stood beside without commentary. He changed in the corridor without embarrassment. She handed him a cloth. He cleaned his hands. He said, "You should leave this place." She said, "You keep telling me to leave." He said, "Because I keep meaning it." She said, "And I keep not leaving." He looked at her. His voice dropped. "Alice." She said, "I know what you are. I have known since the first hallway. I am still here." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and pulled her in without a word, held her with the concentrated force of someone who had not allowed themselves to hold anything in a very long time. She felt the tension in him, the controlled grief of a man who had been strong in all the wrong directions. She put her arms around him. He pressed his forehead to her shoulder. They stood there in the empty corridor while the compound breathed quietly around them, and Seoul turned below, and Alice understood, fully and without flinching, that she had crossed a line she would not cross back. A week later, a man named Ryu appeared. He was an attorney, according to his visiting credentials, and he had legitimate business with the compound's legal division. He also spent a disproportionate amount of time in any space where Alice was working. He was charming in the particular way of men who practice charm the way others practice a sport. He brought her coffee from the kitchen without being asked. He asked her questions about herself that were too interested to be casual. And once, in the corridor outside the library, he touched her arm while making a point about something she no longer remembered, and she saw, from the corner of her eye, Han Sung-jun come around the corner, stop, and go still in a way that was nothing like his usual stillness. She did not see the conversation that happened after. She heard about it from one of the kitchen staff, told in wide-eyed whispered Korean that Alice decoded word by word. Mr. Han had stopped the attorney in the east corridor, had said nothing aggressive, had simply looked at him in a way that made the attorney remember 3 separate meetings he needed to attend elsewhere. The attorney left the compound 2 hours ahead of schedule and did not request a follow-up visit. Alice said nothing about this to Han Sung-jun directly, but that evening when he appeared in the corridor where she was working, she looked at him and said, "You did not have to do that." He said, "I don't know what you're referring to." She said, "The attorney." He straightened his cuffs. She watched the careful blankness on his face and underneath it, the thing he was not saying. He said finally, "I don't like the way certain people look at what is mine." The word landed between them like a stone into still water. She said, "I am not yours." He held her gaze. "Not yet," he said, and walked away before she could respond. That night, she lay in her room staring at the ceiling and understood that she was in serious trouble. The following morning brought news that reordered everything. One of Han Sung-jun's informants inside the Park Syndicate, a rival family that had been circling since Shin's removal, reported that they had obtained documentation of the impotence diagnosis from Shin before his removal. The document had already been distributed to 4 allied families. The window for controlling the narrative had closed. Director Shin had done his damage on the way out. Han Sung-joon called a closed meeting with his remaining senior staff, for men who had been with him long enough to survive multiple reorganizations of loyalty. Alice was not in the meeting. She did not need to be. She felt the shift in the compound's atmosphere the way you feel weather before it arrives. Heavier air, shorter conversations, eyes that moved faster than usual. By late afternoon, she understood that something was coming and coming soon. She was in the library when he found her. He closed the door behind him with the quiet precision of someone who had already decided what they were going to say. He looked at her across the room and said, "I need you to leave Seoul." She set down the book she was not reading. He continued, "I have a property in Jeju. Staffed, secure, no connection to this compound on any public record. I want you there by tomorrow morning." She said, "And if I say no?" He said, "Then I will spend every resource I have protecting you here instead of dismantling the people who are coming for this compound, and I cannot do both properly." She heard the thing underneath the strategy. She said, "You are afraid for me." He said, "I am managing risk." She said, "Han Sung-joon." He stopped. She only used his full name when she wanted him to drop the architecture. He dropped it. His voice came out quieter. "Yes," he said, "I am afraid for you. Because you matter in a way I did not account for, and I cannot think clearly when I am accounting for you, and I need to think clearly in the next 72 hours, or people will die, including possibly me." She absorbed this. She said, "How long?" He said, "Until it's resolved." She said, "And if it's not resolved?" He said nothing, which was its own answer. She crossed the room, stood in front of him. She put her hand flat against his chest, felt his heart doing something complicated under her palm. She said, "You come back. Whatever happens, you come back." He covered her hand with his. His jaw was tight. "I intend to," he said. She said, "Intending is not promising." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I promise." She believed him. She did not know yet that the next 72 hours would not go the way either of them planned. She left for Jeju the next morning. The safe house was a low white structure set back from cliffs overlooking the sea. Beautiful in the way of places designed to hold people who were not supposed to be found. The staff were professional and silent. The security was invisible until it wasn't. She had her phone, but certain numbers were routed and certain calls would not connect, and she understood this was not restriction but protection, which made it only marginally more bearable. She spent the first day cataloging the rooms because movement helped her think. She spent the second day watching the sea and trying not to check the news. On the third day, she found the garden on the eastern side of the property and sat in it until the light changed and thought about the exact way Han Sung-joon had said "I promise." The way his voice had roughened on the second word, like it cost him something to say it. Like promises were currency, he had learned to spend carefully. On the fourth day, Director Yoon arrived. She had not been told about Director Yoon. He was older than Han Sung-joon by roughly 20 years, trim and measured in his movements, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had aged into something more interesting. He introduced himself as a senior associate of the Han family holdings. He sat across from her in the garden with tea she had not offered and said, "You are more composed than I expected." She said, "I was not aware I was expected." He smiled. "Mr. Han described you as formidable." She said, "Did he?" Yoon set his cup down. "The situation in Seoul has escalated. 3 of the outer syndicates moved simultaneously 2 nights ago. They timed it for when Sung-joon's compound was mid-transition after Shin's removal. They were well organized." She felt her chest tighten. "Is he?" "He is alive," Yoon said immediately. "Wounded. Managing. But the compound is locked down and the next 24 hours are critical." She said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her with something like appreciation. He said, "Nothing yet. But I wanted you to hear it from someone who would tell you the truth rather than a managed version." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because he asked me to. If anything happened, he wanted you to have accurate information from a person rather than a notification." She looked at the sea, said nothing for a moment, then said, "How bad is the wound?" Yoon said, "Significant. But he has had worse." She said, "That is not as reassuring as you think it is." He smiled again. "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't. If you were Alice in that garden, what would you have done next? Would you have stayed or gone back for him?" Tell us in the comments. And please like, share, and subscribe to Black and Soul TV because we are just getting started. She went back for him. She did not ask Yoon for permission. She told him she was returning to Seoul and that she would appreciate his help arranging transport, but would manage without it if necessary. He studied her for a moment. Then he made a phone call. The car was ready in 40 minutes. She was in Seoul before midnight. The compound was not what she had left. The east gate had been repaired, but unevenly, the kind of repair done fast under pressure. 2 additional security teams were visible at positions she had memorized when she first arrived. The main residence had its lights on in every room, which meant active occupation rather than staged appearance. She was cleared through 3 checkpoints. At the 4th, one of Han Sung-jun's personal guards, a quiet man named Tae who had always nodded at her in the corridors, looked at her and said, "He said you would come back." She said, "Is he awake?" Tae said, "He will be when he hears you're here." He was in the medical room on the 2nd floor. She had not known the compound had a medical room. She was learning there were many rooms she had not known about. He was propped up against pillows, shirt off, a professional dressing covering his left side from below the armpit to the hip. He looked pale and controlled, and when she walked through the door his entire face did something she had only seen once before, in the linen corridor, when she had said someone should ask if you're safe. The careful architecture of him simply opened. "Alice," he said, "you were supposed to stay in Jeju." "I know," she said. She crossed to the chair beside the bed and sat down. She looked at the dressing. She looked at his face. She said, "You look terrible." He said, "You came back." She said, "I told you to come back. Someone had to demonstrate how it's done." He looked at her for a long moment. His hand moved across the sheet toward her, and she took it. His grip was warm and tight, and slightly unsteady, which told her more about the pain he was managing than anything else would have. He said quietly, "I am not good at this." She said, "At what?" He said, "Needing someone." She said, "You don't have to be good at it. You just have to let it happen." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the exhaustion was more visible, but something else was too. Something that sat underneath all the control like a current. He said, "I thought about you the whole time." She said, "Was that distracting?" He said, "Catastrophically." She laughed, and he smiled, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and she thought, there it is. There is the man underneath the organization. She stayed that night. Not in the medical room. The staff moved a chair into an adjacent sitting room where she could hear if he called. But she was there. And in the morning when she brought him coffee because she had found where the kitchen kept the good beans and she knew how he took it, he looked at her over the rim of the cup and said, "Why are you like this?" She said, "Like what?" He said, "Like this. Like someone who stays." She shrugged. "My mother always said there are 2 kinds of people, those who leave when things get heavy and those who get heavier right alongside you." He said, "And you are the second kind." She said, "I am definitely the second kind." He said, "Your mother sounds like she was remarkable." She said, "She was." He said, "I would have liked to meet her." Alice looked at him. The simplicity of the statement hit her somewhere undefended. She said, "She would have seen right through you." He said, "Most people don't manage that." She said, "She wasn't most people." He held her gaze. "Neither are you," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a conclusion. The kind a careful man arrives at after a long deliberation. 2 weeks into his recovery, the external pressure reorganized itself. The 3 syndicates that had moved on the compound simultaneously had not achieved what they intended. Han Sung-jun had repelled the primary breach and responded in the days following with a precision that, according to Yoon, had permanently removed 2 of the 3 families from the conversation. The third had gone quiet in a way that suggested they were recalculating. But the impotence documentation was still circulating, and a successor narrative had begun to form in certain circles, the story that Han Sung-jun was finished, that his empire was a body still moving before it understood it was dead. He knew about the narrative. He tracked it with the same cold attention he gave every threat. What he did not tell Alice was that the narrative had one specific anchor, a man named Oh Byung-soo, a senior figure in the Allied network who had been neutral for years and whose support or opposition would determine how the broader community aligned. Oh Byung-soo had requested a meeting, and the nature of that meeting would determine the next 12 months. Alice found out about it not from Han Sung-jun, but from Yoon, who had developed the habit of briefing her with the accuracy Han Sung-jun had promised her in his study weeks ago. Yoon said, "The meeting is in 4 days. If Sung Joon presents as weakened, Oh will move against him. If he presents as stable, as someone who has weathered the breach and retained full command, Oh will stay neutral. Neutral is a form of victory at this stage. She said, what does he need? Yoon looked at her with the measured expression of a man choosing his words. He said, he needs to appear whole. She understood. She said, is this where you ask me to perform something? Yoon said, this is where I tell you what the situation is and leave the decision entirely to you. She said, and if I decline? He said, then we find another approach. She said, but there isn't one. He said, not one is clean. She sat with it. Then she said, does he know you're telling me this? Yoon said, he told me not to. She said, but you did anyway. He said, because he will not ask you himself. He would rather find the other approach. She said, why? Yoon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because he does not want you to do anything for strategic reasons. He wants to know that whatever you do because you choose to. She looked at Yoon for a long moment. She said, he is more complicated than he looks. Yoon said, considerably. She went to Han Sung-joon that evening. He was at his desk for the first time since the attack, moving carefully and working with the concentrated ferocity of a man compensating for lost time. She closed the door. He looked up. She said, tell me about the O meeting. He went still. She said, Yoon told me. Don't be annoyed with him. He said, I'm not annoyed. She said, you look annoyed. He said, I am managing my expression. She sat across from him. She said, what do you need me to do? He said, nothing. She said, Han Sung-joon. He said, I mean it. I will not use you for strategy again. She said, what if I'm offering? He looked at her steadily. He said, are you? She said, I am sitting across from you offering, and you are making it very difficult. He leaned back. Something shifted in his face. He said, if you are beside me at the meeting, I will draw conclusions. She said, let him. He said, Alice, the conclusions he draws will follow you. The association with me, with what I am and what I run, that does not disappear. She said, I know what I'm associating with. I have known since the first hallway. He said, this is different. She said, how? He said quietly, because this would mean I am serious about you. In a way that is visible. In a way I cannot take back. She held his gaze across the desk. She said, are you serious about me? He held her gaze right back. He said, catastrophically. She said, then stop managing it and let it be visible. The Oh Byung-soo meeting was held in a private dining room in a building that officially did not exist on any registered property roll in Seoul. Alice wore a dress she had not brought to the compound, which Yoon had arranged without comment, dark green, simple, the kind of thing that communicated stability rather than performance. Han Sung-joon met her at the car and looked at her in a way that communicated several complete sentences without any of them being spoken. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked in together. Oh Byung-soo was in his 60s, round-faced, with eyes that processed information faster than his expression let on. He greeted Han Sung-joon with the measured warmth of a man calibrating in real time. His eyes moved to Alice immediately, and then back to Han Sung-joon, and Alice watched the calculation complete. She did not perform anything. She sat beside Han Sung-joon throughout the meal and spoke when spoken to and listened carefully, and once, when Oh made a comment about succession and legacy in the abstract political language these men used for everything real, she said calmly, some legacies are built over decades, and some are built in a single generation. What matters is what you are building toward, not what you started with. The table went quiet for a moment. Oh looked at her with the first genuine expression she had seen from him. Han Sung-joon's hand found hers under the table. Pressed once. She understood what the pressure meant. Oh Byung-soo declared his neutrality the following morning. Yoon delivered the news with the closest thing to relief she had seen on his face. Han Sung-joon received it in his study with the stillness of a man who had learned not to celebrate until the next threat had been identified. But when Yoon left and it was only Alice in the room, he looked at her from across his desk and said, you changed the room last night. She said, I just spoke honestly. He said, in my world, honest speech in a room full of careful men is one of the most disruptive things possible. She said, maybe your world needs more disruption. He said, it has you now. That seems sufficient. What Alice did not know, and what no one told her for another 11 days, was that she was pregnant. She understood it before the confirmation, the way the body sometimes delivers information before the mind is ready to receive it. A tiredness that sat at a different depth than exhaustion. A sensitivity to smell that rearranged her mornings. She bought the test from a pharmacy in a neighborhood she had no other reason to visit, wearing sunglasses and moving with the deliberate casualness of someone trying not to look deliberate. She took it in the small bathroom of her compound room with the door locked and the water running for no practical reason. She sat on the cold tile floor after and stayed there for a long time. The result was not ambiguous. She was pregnant. She was pregnant with the child of a man who had told her for months that he could not have children. She sat on the floor and thought about the medical condition. 14 months, he had said, and the treatments she had seen him take, which she had assumed were for the impotence itself, which she had never asked about because she had decided the medical details of his body were his to share or not share. She thought about the night they had spent together in his room. The impossible calculus of a situation where nothing should have been possible and something was anyway. She sat on the tile floor and pressed her hands flat against her stomach and thought, what now? She had not told him yet when you knocked on her door the following evening. He came in, sat down, and she knew from the way he arranged himself that he had not come with good news. He said, there is something I should have told you sooner. She said, about the treatments. He went still. She said, I know about the hormone treatments. I guessed. He said, how long have you known? She said, not long. But I know. He said, then you may already know what I am going to tell you. She said, tell me anyway. He said, the treatments were prescribed and monitored by a specialist I arranged privately. They have been working. His levels have been normalizing for several months. The impotence is resolving. He was not told the full extent of the progress because I was concerned about how he would process information about his own body after the level of shame he had attached to the condition. She said, Yoon. He said yes. She said, I'm pregnant. The room went very quiet. Yoon looked at her. She said, I took a test yesterday. It's clear. He absorbed this with the expression of a man who is doing rapid assessment of about 11 different implications simultaneously. He said, does he know? She said, not yet. I need it a day. He said, Alice. She said, I know. He said, you understand what a child means in the context of what he runs. She said, I understand what a child means in the context of any life. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you have to tell him. She said, I know. He said, tell him before anyone else finds out. In this world, information like this travels in dangerous directions very fast. She said, I know Yoon. He stood. He looked at her with something that was not quite apology, but lived in the same neighborhood. He said, for what it's worth, this was not by design. Not yours or his. She said, I know. He said, and for what else it's worth, he is going to be better at this than either of you expects. She looked at him. He said, I have known him for 11 years. I have watched him be ruthless, and I have watched him be careful, and I have watched him be genuinely good on the rare occasions someone gave him the conditions for it. She gave him those conditions. He looked at her directly. You gave him those conditions. Whatever comes next, that part is not complicated. She told Han Sung-joon that night. She went to his study after the compound had quieted. He was working, which he usually was at that hour, but he set everything down when she came in without her having to ask. He had learned to read the specific quality of her presence in a room. She sat across from him. She said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. He said, all right. She said, I am pregnant. She watched the words reach him, watched his face do something she had never seen it do. It was not the controlled stillness. It was not the cold assessment. It was something entirely undefended, something that moved across his features like the first real weather on a day that had been artificially still. He said nothing for a long moment. She said, I know the timing is. He said, how? She said, I don't have a full answer to that. The treatments, your body normalizing, the night in your room. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he said, you are certain? She said yes. He stood, came around the desk, crouched in front of her chair so they were at the same level. He put his hands on her face with extraordinary care. He said, are you all right? Not are you certain, not what do we do, not what does this mean for the organization. Are you all right? She said, I think so. I'm still working out what to feel. He said, take whatever time you need. She said, you're not. He said, I know exactly what I feel. She said, tell me. He said, I feel like the world just reorganized itself, and I like the new arrangement. She looked at him. He said, I know what this means for the danger around us. I know what enemies will do with this information. I know the complications. And none of that changes what I just said. She said, Han Sung-jun. He said, I know what I want, Alice. I have known for a while. I was waiting to be certain you knew too. She said, I know what I want. He said, then we are agreed. She said, we are agreed. He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that while the compound breathed around them, and Seoul turned below, and something that had been building since a corridor and a broken decanter and a woman who did not run finally settled into its shape. 3 weeks later, the threat came from a direction they had not fully closed. A man named Kwok, affiliated loosely with the remnants of the Third Syndicate that had gone quiet after the compound breach, had obtained enough information through secondary sources to piece together the pregnancy. He moved fast. A targeted operation toward the Jeju property, which he had traced through older records, combined with a direct approach toward Alice in Seoul when she was in transit between the compound and a medical appointment. She had a security detail. The detail was competent. But Kwok's people were also competent, and they had timed it for a gap in coverage that should not have existed, which meant there was still a minor leak somewhere in the organizational infrastructure, and Han Sung-jun had not yet located it. The vehicle was boxed in on a bridge. Alice was not hurt, but she was taken out of the car and into another vehicle before the security team could close the distance. It lasted 11 minutes before Han Sung-jun's response team intercepted the transfer. 11 minutes was not long in objective time. It was an eternity in the specific quality of those minutes inside that vehicle. He was there when they brought her back, standing at the compound entrance when the car pulled through, and the look on his face when he saw her walk out unharmed was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen from him, not because it was cold, but because it was the opposite, raw and shaking and barely held. He crossed to her in 4 steps and held her without saying anything, and she felt him trembling and understood that what was in his arms right now was not Han Sung-jun the organization or Han Sung-jun the feared name. It was just a man who had spent 11 minutes understanding what losing her would mean. He said against her hair, I am ending this. I am ending all of it today. She said, what does that mean? He said, Kwok. The leak. All of it. By morning. She said, and you. He pulled back to look at her. She said, I need you to come back from this. Whatever you do tonight, you come back. He said, I promise. She believed him for the second time. Kwok was resolved before dawn. The leak was a mid-level security coordinator who had been managing 2 separate loyalties for 8 months and was removed from the situation permanently. By 6 in the morning, the compound was quieter than it had been in weeks. Han Sung-jun came back. He sat on the edge of her bed where she had been awake waiting and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, it is done. She said, are you hurt? He said, no. She said, are you all right? He said, I will be. He looked at her. He said, I want to talk to you about something when you are ready. She said, I am ready now. He said, I want out. She did not respond immediately. He said, not everything. Not completely. There are structures that would fall and people who would be hurt if I simply disappeared. But the active operations, the violence, the part of what I run that requires me to be what I have been. I want to build something different. Something that is still powerful, but does not require me to be unreachable. He looked at her hands. He said, I want to be reachable. By you. By this child. I want to be the kind of man who can be found, not just feared. She said, that is going to be very hard. He said, I know. She said, it will take years. He said, I have years. If you are in them. She looked at him. She said, I am in them. He said, then I will do the work. She said, I know you will. He said, how do you know? She said, because you are the second kind. He looked at her. She said, you are one of the people who gets heavier right alongside. He held her gaze. Then he took her hand and held it the same careful way he had the first night in his room. Warm and deliberate and slightly trembling. And this time she knew the trembling was not weakness. It was the specific weight of choosing something that matters. 6 months later, Han Sung-jun and Alice Johnson were married in a small ceremony in the garden of a house in the south of the country that no organizational database had any record of. Yoon attended. 3 of Han Sung-jun's most trusted people attended. Alice's sister flew in from Nashville and cried through the entire thing, and afterward told Han Sung-jun, that if he ever made Alice cry for a bad reason, she would find him regardless of how many compounds he had, and he said, "I believe you," with the first fully genuine smile Alice had seen him give to anyone who was not her. The officiant was brief. The vows were not. Han Sung-joon had written his and read them with the concentrated difficulty of a man who had spent 34 years building a self that did not require vulnerability and was now choosing to dismantle it word by word in front of the small number of people he trusted. He said, "You found me when I had stopped believing I was findable. You stayed when staying was not rational. You gave me back the parts of myself I had decided were weaknesses, and you were right that they were not. I am choosing you completely, and I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life, which I intend to spend becoming someone worthy of the way you looked at me in that first hallway." Alice did not have dry eyes during this. She had planned to. She was not a crier. She cried anyway. Her vows were shorter and more precise in the way of someone who does not over-explain the things they are certain of. She said, "You are not who they said you were. You are harder and softer and more complicated and more worth knowing. I choose you knowing exactly what that means. I will keep choosing you every morning. That is my promise, and I keep my promises." He said, "I know." That came out rough. Everyone smiled. Their daughter was born on a clear morning in early spring. She arrived with the particular urgency of a person who has decided the external world is more interesting than waiting, and she was immediately and absolutely herself. They named her Seo Yun, which Yoon told Alice meant gentle and graceful, and Alice said, "We will see about that." Han Sung-joon held her in the first hour with the expression of a man confronting something so completely outside his previous understanding of himself that all the language he had developed over 34 years was simply not adequate. He said nothing for a long time, just held her and looked at her. Alice watched him from the bed and thought, there it is again. There is the man underneath everything else. He looked up eventually and found Alice watching him, and his face did the thing it always did now when he caught her watching. It opened without apology. He said, "You were right." She said, "I usually am." He said, "I mean about all of it. About it being possible to be something different. To choose something better." She said, "I know." He said, "I am going to spend a very long time proving you were right." She said, "You already started." He said, "Not long enough ago." She said, "Han Sung-joon." He said, "Yes." She said, "Come here." He came. He sat beside her on the narrow hospital bed with So-yeon between them, and outside the window Seoul turned in its ordinary way, loud and complex and indifferent to the specific miracle happening on the 6th floor of a private clinic, and inside the room the paper tiger was completely and finally gone. In his place a man who had learned the hardest possible lesson in the hardest possible way, that the real empire is the one you build from tenderness, that the lasting power is the kind that chooses gentleness even when it has every option not to, that love, real love, the kind that stays and gets heavier right alongside, is not a weakness in the architecture. It is the only load-bearing wall. This was the story of Han Sung-joon and Alice Johnson, a mafia boss who found his undoing in a woman who did not flinch, a woman who stayed when every rational instinct said run, and the impossible life they chose to build from the ruins of everything that came before. Did this story move you? From the first hallway to the last vow, which moment stayed with you the longest? Tell us in the comments, and then please like, share, and subscribe to Black and Soul TV because we have more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. Hit the bell so you are always the first to know when we drop. Thank you for being here, and remember, some people burn down empires for love, and some loves are worth every flame.